The words appeared on the giant screen behind my son's wedding table like they had been waiting years to hurt me. Old, useless, abandoned mother. The letters were bright enough that even the guests sitting in the back could read them clearly. 200 people in that hall, dressed in silk and suits, turned their heads slowly toward me at table 17. Some laughed nervously, some whispered, and a few simply stared, the way people look at something uncomfortable but impossible to ignore. My son raised his champagne glass, smiling like this was the cleverest joke he had ever planned. And my daughter-in-law leaned into the microphone and said sweetly, "Oh, don't worry, everyone. She's used to disappointment." My fingers tightened around my phone beneath the tablecloth, the small screen lighting my trembling hands in the dark. My husband had died 6 years earlier, and since then I had learned how quiet loneliness could be. But humiliation had a sound. It sounded like clinking glasses, muffled laughter, chairs shifting, people pretending they weren't enjoying the show. I didn't cry. Instead, I opened the message I had already typed earlier that afternoon. One word. Just one. Start. And when I pressed send, the entire wedding reception fell silent within seconds. The kind of silence where even the ice melting in someone's drink could be heard across the room. What happened next didn't just ruin my son's wedding reception. It unraveled 23 years of lies my own family had carefully built around me, brick by brick, until everyone believed I was nothing more than the burden they described on that screen. But before I tell you how that night ended, I need to take you back to the moment I first realized my children had already decided who I was long before this wedding day. I am Margaret Hale. I turned 70 last spring. My hands shake sometimes now when I pour tea, and the doctor says my blood pressure rises when I'm under stress. But there was a time when these same hands worked 12-hour shifts in a hospital kitchen so my children could go to good schools. There was a time when I stitched torn uniforms late into the night, my glasses slipping down my nose while the house slept. There was a time when my sons hugged me every morning before school, their small arms wrapped around my waist like I was the safest place in the world. That was before my husband died, and before my children decided I was no longer useful. 4 weeks before the wedding, I was sitting alone in my small apartment on the 3rd floor of a quiet retirement building. The hallway outside always smelled faintly of disinfectant and old carpet, and the elevator rattled every time it reached my floor. I had just finished washing the dinner dishes when the phone rang. It was nearly 10 at night, the hour when most older women like me are already in bed listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the kitchen clock. The caller ID showed my son Daniel's name. I hadn't heard from him in almost 3 months. My heart jumped in my chest the way it used to when he was a little boy, running toward me after school with scraped knees and stories to tell. I wiped my hands on a towel and answered quickly, afraid he might hang up if I waited too long. "Mom," he said. His voice sounded rushed, distracted, like someone talking while doing something else. "I'm getting married next month." "No hello?" "No. How are you?" Just the news, dropped like a package at my door. For a moment I didn't speak. I looked around my tiny kitchen, the pale yellow light reflecting off the clean dishes in the drying rack. My son was getting married, and this was the first I had heard about it. "That's wonderful, Daniel," I finally said, my voice careful, gentle. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" There was a short pause. I could hear music in the background, laughter, glasses clinking. He was probably out celebrating with friends. "Well," he said, "Lena wasn't sure if inviting you would be comfortable." Comfortable. The words sat between us like something fragile. I had met Lena only twice in the 3 years they had been together. Both times she had spoken to me politely, but with the kind of distant smile people give strangers in a waiting room. "I understand," I said softly, even though my chest tightened. "But I'd love to come, if you want me there." Another pause. Then he sighed. "You can come, Mom. But there are a few things you need to keep in mind." I stood there holding the phone, the cold kitchen floor pressing through my slippers, while my son began explaining the rules for attending his wedding. Rules that sounded less like an invitation and more like instructions for staying out of the way. "You will sit at the back table. You won't give a speech. Please don't mention the past, and try not to make Lena uncomfortable." When he finished speaking, I looked out the small kitchen window at the dark parking lot below, where a single street lamp flickered over empty spaces. "I promise," I said quietly, "I won't cause any trouble." He sounded relieved when he hung up. That should have been my first warning. But mothers have a dangerous habit. We always hope the next moment will be kinder than the last. And I still believed, foolishly, that my son wanted me there because somewhere deep down, he still remembered the mother who raised him. I had no idea that the wedding wasn't meant to welcome me. It was meant to finish the story they had been telling about me for years. And by the time I finally understood that truth, I was already sitting at table 17, watching my own children turn my life into a joke on a 10-foot screen. But what they didn't know, what none of them expected, was that I had already prepared for that moment long before the music stopped and the laughter filled the room. And when the screen suddenly went black that night, their perfect wedding story began to collapse in front of everyone. You might think the worst moment of my life was the second my children projected those cruel words onto a giant screen at my son's wedding. But the truth is, humiliation rarely begins in public. It begins quietly years earlier, growing slowly inside small moments that nobody else notices. The phone calls that come less often, the invitations that stop arriving, the conversations where people talk around you instead of to you. And by the time the public humiliation finally arrives, everyone already believes the story they have been told about you. 4 weeks before that wedding, I was sitting alone in my small apartment on the third floor of a quiet retirement building, the kind of place where the hallways always smell faintly of cleaning chemicals and old carpet, and where the elevator rattles like it has been tired of its job for the last 20 years. I had just finished washing the dinner dishes and was drying the last plate when my phone rang, and when I saw my son Daniel's name on the screen, my heart jumped the same way it used to when he was a little boy running home from school, with grass stains on his knees and excitement in his voice. I hadn't heard from him in almost 3 months, so when I answered, I expected a simple conversation. Maybe news about work or a casual visit planned for the weekend. But instead he spoke quickly, almost impatiently, and the first words out of his mouth were, "Mom, I'm getting married next month." For a moment I thought I had misunderstood him because mothers usually hear about weddings long before the invitations are sent. We help choose flowers. We talk about guest lists. We offer advice that our children politely ignore. But in that moment, I realized my son's wedding had been planned without me even knowing it existed. I congratulated him anyway, because that is what mothers do, even when their hearts feel suddenly very small. And I asked why he hadn't mentioned it before. But he hesitated in a way that made my chest tighten. And then he said something that sounded harmless on the surface but carried a quiet weight underneath it. He said, "Lena wasn't sure if my presence would make the wedding comfortable." That word stayed with me long after the phone call ended. Comfortable. As if I were some awkward piece of furniture people didn't know where to place in a carefully decorated room. Still, Daniel eventually said I could attend, but there were conditions. Small rules disguised as requests. Things like sitting toward the back of the reception hall, avoiding conversations about the past, and not saying anything that might embarrass Lena in front of her family. I promised him I wouldn't cause trouble, because mothers become experts at promising silence when their children ask for it. And after the call ended, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the quiet room around me, the ticking clock on the wall marking the passing minutes, while memories of another life slowly returned to me. There was a time when that kitchen had been full of noise. Two boys running in and out of the house, their father laughing as he tried to keep order at the dinner table, backpacks dropped on the floor, shoes kicked off near the door, and me moving between the stove and the sink, trying to keep everything together. But 6 years earlier, my husband Thomas had died suddenly from a heart attack, and the house that once felt alive slowly became too quiet for one person to fill. After he died, the responsibility for everything fell on my shoulders. The mortgage, the bills, the small construction company he had built over 3 decades. And while my sons promised to help, they were young, and their own lives were beginning to move forward quickly. I worked long hours trying to keep things stable, sometimes taking extra shifts at the hospital kitchen after selling the company, sometimes skipping sleep just to make sure my boys would never feel the weight of what we had lost. At the time, I believed that sacrifice was simply part of motherhood, that one day when life slowed down, my sons would remember who had been there for them during those difficult years. But as I sat alone in that quiet apartment holding my phone after Daniel's call, I began to wonder whether the story my children were telling about me had slowly changed into something I no longer recognized. Still, I convinced myself the wedding might be a chance to repair what time had quietly broken between us. Because hope is a stubborn thing. Inside a mother's heart, it stays alive, even when common sense suggests it should finally let go. What I didn't realize then was that while I was hoping the wedding might bring my family back together, my children were already preparing something very different for that reception hall. Something they believed would finally define who I was in front of everyone who mattered to them. And by the time the wedding day arrived, the version of my life they planned to show the world had already been prepared, slide by slide, waiting patiently inside a computer connected to that enormous screen behind the head table. The morning of the wedding arrived with the kind of quiet that makes a person feel like the day is holding its breath. And I woke before sunrise in my small apartment, while pale morning light filtered through the curtains and stretched across the kitchen floor. I sat at the table with a cup of coffee warming my hands, listening to the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of cars passing on the street below. And for a moment, I allowed myself to imagine that the day might still hold something good for our family. Weddings are supposed to bring people together. After all, they are meant to mark beginnings rather than endings. And despite everything that had happened over the past few years, I still believed somewhere deep inside that my son would look at me during the ceremony and remember the woman who had raised him, the woman who stayed awake through fevers and nightmares, the woman who worked extra shifts so he could attend college without worrying about money. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing a navy dress I had purchased for a church event the year before. Something simple and modest that wouldn't draw attention. And I fastened the pearl earrings my husband had given me many years ago on our anniversary. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I noticed the small changes age had left behind, the soft lines around my eyes, the silver strands in my hair, the faint tremor in my hands when I adjusted the collar of my dress. But I also saw the quiet strength that comes from surviving things most people never have to face alone. Around noon, I took a taxi to the church where the ceremony was being held, and when I stepped out into the bright autumn sunlight, the parking lot was already full of expensive cars, their polished surfaces reflecting the clear sky above. Guests gathered near the entrance in small groups, greeting one another with warm smiles and laughter, the kind of easy familiarity that reminded me how distant I had become from my own son's world. Inside the church, the air smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh flowers, and as I walked down the aisle toward the back pew, I felt several pairs of eyes turn in my direction before quickly looking away again. Some of those people probably recognized me as Daniel's mother. Others had likely heard the version of my story that had quietly circulated through Lena's family over the years. Stories about how difficult I had become after my husband died. Stories about how my sons had struggled to maintain peace while dealing with an aging parent who could no longer manage her own life. I sat quietly in the last row, folding my hands in my lap while the church slowly filled with guests. And eventually, the music began. As Lena appeared at the end of the aisle in a long white dress that shimmered softly under the lights. Daniel stood near the altar beside his groomsmen, adjusting his tie nervously, and for a brief moment, our eyes met across the room. I smiled and lifted my hand slightly, a small gesture meant to remind him that I was there, that no matter how distant things had become between us, I was still proud of the man he had grown into. He nodded once, quickly, and then turned his attention back to the ceremony. The vows were beautiful. The kind people rehearse carefully so they sound effortless when spoken aloud. Promises about love, patience, and building a life together through whatever challenges the future might bring. I felt tears gather in my eyes while listening, because a mother never truly stops hoping her child will find happiness, even when she herself has been quietly pushed to the edges of that child's life. After the ceremony, the guests moved to a large country club where the reception was being held, a place filled with crystal chandeliers and round tables covered in white linen that reflected the warm glow of candlelight. A hostess checked the seating chart and guided me politely toward table 17 in the far corner of the room near the kitchen doors, a spot where the sounds of clattering dishes drifted out every time a waiter pushed through the swinging doors behind me. My table companions were distant acquaintances who spent most of the evening discussing travel plans and retirement investments, and while they spoke kindly enough, it was clear none of them really knew who I was, beyond the simple label printed beside my name on the seating chart. At the front of the hall, Daniel and Lena sat at the head table, surrounded by friends and close family, laughter echoing around them as waiters moved between tables carrying glasses of champagne. Speeches began shortly after dinner was served. First, Lena's father welcoming Daniel into their family, then several friends sharing stories about college adventures and vacations that made the room erupt in laughter. When Daniel finally stood to speak, the room grew quiet with anticipation, and after thanking his new wife and her parents, he glanced briefly toward the back corner where I was seated. "Family always adds its own special stories to a wedding," he said with a light chuckle, and the guests responded with polite laughter while I felt a strange heaviness settle in my stomach. A few minutes later, Lena's maid of honor stepped onto the small stage holding a remote control and announced that before the dancing began, they had prepared a slideshow celebrating Daniel and Lena's journey together. The lights dimmed slowly across the hall as the large projection screen behind the head table flickered to life. And at first, the images were exactly what you would expect at a wedding reception: childhood photos, vacations, smiling faces, and happy memories that made the guests laugh warmly. But then the music changed, shifting into something playful and teasing, and a new title appeared across the screen in large, bright letters. And now, let's take a look at the rest of the family. At that exact moment, I felt something inside my chest tighten, because the way Lena glanced toward the back of the room told me very clearly that whatever came next had been planned far more carefully than a simple wedding slideshow. And beneath the table, where no one could see it, My phone rested quietly inside my purse, with a message already typed and waiting for the moment I hoped would never come. When the first photograph of me appeared on the giant screen behind the head table, the reaction in the room was hesitant laughter, the kind people produce when they believe they are supposed to find something amusing, but aren't completely certain yet. It was an old picture taken years earlier at a family picnic, the sunlight hitting my face at an awkward angle while I was speaking to someone outside the frame, and across the bottom of the image, large white letters appeared slowly enough that every guest had time to read them clearly. Retired and useless. A few guests chuckled politely while others shifted in their chairs, glancing toward the back of the hall where I sat quietly beside the kitchen doors. The music continued playing, and another slide appeared. This time, a photograph taken shortly after my husband's funeral, when exhaustion had hollowed my face and grief had settled behind my eyes. Beneath it, another caption appeared. Can't manage life without her husband. The laughter grew louder now, spreading across the room as more people began to understand the tone of the presentation. At the head table, Lena leaned toward the microphone with a playful smile and said lightly, "Oh, don't worry, everyone. It's all meant with love." Another photograph appeared, one taken outside my apartment building from across the street. A picture I realized someone must have taken without me noticing while I was unlocking the front door last winter. The caption read simply, "Lives alone." By the time the fourth slide appeared labeled, "Always complaining," the laughter had begun to feel uncomfortable even to the guests who had initially joined in, because humiliation is a strange form of entertainment. People often laugh first and only later realize they are witnessing something deeply cruel. But the final slide was the one that silenced the entire room. It showed a picture of me sitting alone on a park bench during the previous winter, bundled inside my coat while staring out across a frozen lake, and beneath the image, enormous red letters filled the screen. Abandoned mother. For several seconds, no one spoke. I could hear the soft clinking of glassware and the faint hum of the projector behind the screen, while guests looked at one another uncertainly. Then Lena leaned toward the microphone again and said in a voice sweet enough to disguise the sharp edge beneath it, "Don't feel too bad for her. She always says she's perfectly happy being alone." Daniel laughed and lifted his glass slightly before adding, "Mom has always been a little dramatic." 200 people sat frozen between laughter and discomfort, unsure whether to continue playing along with the joke or acknowledge the cruelty they were witnessing. In that moment, something unexpected settled quietly inside me. It wasn't anger, and it wasn't sadness. It was something calmer, something clearer. The realization that humiliation only holds power when the person being humiliated tries desperately to defend themselves. Slowly, I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone beneath the table where the dim glow of the screen lit my trembling hands. The message I had typed earlier that afternoon was still waiting there, a single word that I had hoped would remain unused. Start. Earlier that day, I had sent certain documents to someone I trusted deeply, someone who understood exactly what my children might attempt at this wedding, and had promised to help if the moment ever arrived. I looked up once more at the enormous red letters glowing above the head table, the words, "Abandoned Mother," hanging in the air like a verdict already decided. My children believed they had told my story for the final time. They believed everyone in that room had accepted their version of who I was. And most importantly, they believed I would sit quietly in the corner, exactly where they had placed me. My thumb hovered above the screen for a brief second before pressing send. 3 seconds later, the slideshow froze. Confused murmurs spread across the reception hall as the screen went black and Lena frowned toward the back of the room. "Looks like we're having a small technical problem. she said into the microphone, forcing a laugh while gesturing toward the control booth. But in that booth, someone had already replaced the presentation file with a different one entirely. A moment later, the screen flickered back to life, and this time the title that appeared across it was not meant to entertain the guests. It was meant to tell a story no one in that room had ever heard before, the truth about Margaret Hale. And for the first time that evening, every single face in the hall turned toward me. Not with laughter, but with quiet attention, because the next slide that appeared on that screen was not a joke at all. It was the beginning of the truth my children had spent years trying to bury. For a few seconds after the screen changed, the entire reception hall fell into a silence so complete that even the soft hum of the projector sounded louder than before, and I could feel 200 people holding their breath while they waited to see what would appear next. The title remained glowing across the screen: The Truth About Margaret Hale. And in that moment, I realized something strange about humiliation. When someone finally decides to stop defending themselves, the truth begins speaking much louder than any insult ever could. The first slide appeared slowly, a scanned document from more than 15 years earlier. And although many of the guests couldn't read the smaller details from their tables, the bold header across the top was impossible to miss: Hale Construction Company. Ownership transfer. Murmurs spread through the hall as the next slide zoomed closer, highlighting the signatures clearly. Mine at the bottom, and just above it, the names of my sons, Daniel and Michael. I watched Daniel's face carefully from across the room as the realization began creeping slowly into his expression, because he understood immediately what those papers meant, even before anyone else in the hall did. The next slide appeared with a simple caption underneath it: After Thomas Hale died, Margaret Hale transferred the family business entirely to her sons without keeping a single share. A few guests leaned forward in their chairs, now whispering quietly among themselves while the slideshow continued. The next image showed a bank record from several years ago, followed by another, and another. The numbers highlighted clearly as a calm voice began narrating softly through the speakers. The voice of the attorney I had contacted earlier that afternoon. He explained gently that after my husband passed away, the company we had built together for 3 decades had been placed fully in my sons' names so they could continue the family legacy without worrying about inheritance complications or taxes. Another slide appeared, showing the mortgage papers for the house where my boys had grown up, and beneath it a caption read: House sold to pay Daniel's university tuition and Michael's startup loan. The whispers grew louder across the hall now, because what the guests were seeing didn't match the story they had been quietly told about me for years. Lena shifted uncomfortably in her chair while Daniel stared at the screen with a stiff expression that looked almost frozen. Then the next slide appeared, and this one showed a photograph that made my chest tighten unexpectedly. A picture of me sitting beside Daniel's hospital bed when he was 17 years old after a serious car accident. My hair pulled back hastily, dark circles under my eyes from several sleepless nights. Beneath the image, the caption read simply, 3 weeks sleeping in a hospital chair. The narration continued calmly, explaining how the medical bills had been covered by selling the remaining equipment from my husband's construction company. Equipment I had once hoped would help my sons build their own careers. I watched the faces in the room carefully now. The same people who had laughed only minutes earlier were sitting very still, their expressions slowly changing as the story unfolded piece by piece. The next slide appeared, showing a photograph of my small apartment building, taken from the street outside, the same picture Lena had used earlier to mock me. But this time, the caption beneath it read something very different. Margaret Hale moved here after selling the family home so her sons could keep the business debt-free. A quiet ripple of surprise moved through the room as the truth settled into place for the first time. At the head table, Lena leaned toward Daniel, whispering something urgently, but he didn't answer her, his eyes still fixed on the glowing screen where the next image was already appearing. It was a simple photograph taken years earlier in our old backyard, my two boys standing beside their father while holding small wooden toolboxes he had built for them, their smiles wide and careless in the summer sunlight. Beneath the image, the caption read softly, "Everything Margaret Hale built was given to her sons." And as the screen faded slowly to black again, I could feel the atmosphere inside the reception hall shifting in a way my children had never expected, because the story they had carefully constructed about me was beginning to collapse under the quiet weight of the truth. But what they still didn't understand yet was that the slideshow wasn't finished. Not even close. And the next part of the story was the one I had spent 6 long years waiting for someone to finally hear. The silence in the reception hall after those slides ended felt heavier than anything that had come before it. The kind of silence that settles slowly over a room when people realize they may have judged someone far too quickly. For a moment the screen stayed dark, and I noticed several guests turning their heads toward Daniel and Lena at the head table, as if expecting them to laugh again or explain that the presentation was still part of some elaborate wedding joke. But no one was laughing anymore. The projector flickered softly, and another slide appeared. This one showing a series of bank statements arranged side by side with several dates circled in red. The attorney's calm voice returned through the speakers, explaining that after transferring the family business to my sons, I had continued working quietly for several years at the hospital kitchen in our town. A job I took because I wanted my boys to have time to grow their careers without worrying about supporting me. The next slide highlighted small monthly transfers from my account to Daniel's during the early years of his company, each one labeled "temporary help" in my handwriting. A soft murmur moved through the guests again as the pattern became clear. I saw Daniel's shoulders stiffen slightly, while Lena's smile had completely disappeared now, replaced by an expression that looked dangerously close to panic. The slideshow continued, revealing that during those same years my sons had gradually stopped visiting, their messages becoming shorter, their calls less frequent, until eventually months would pass without hearing from them at all. The narration never accused them directly. It simply presented dates, bank records, and messages printed on the screen exactly as they had been sent. Then another image appeared, one that made several guests lean closer to read it. It was a letter written by Michael 5 years earlier, explaining politely that he believed it would be healthier for everyone if I began living more independently, so that he and Daniel could focus on their families and careers. Beneath the letter, a simple note appeared. 2 months later, Margaret Hale sold the family home. I could see people beginning to understand now, slowly connecting the small details my children had hoped would remain hidden. The apartment they had mocked earlier wasn't evidence that I had been abandoned. It was proof of how much I had quietly given away to protect the future they wanted. The next slide appeared with a photograph taken outside the hospital kitchen where I worked, my uniform slightly wrinkled after a long shift, my hair tied back while I carried a box of groceries toward the bus stop. Beneath it, the caption read, softly, "Age 67, still working to stay independent." A few guests lowered their eyes at that point, clearly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. At the head table, Daniel finally stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor while he looked toward the projection booth as if he might stop the presentation entirely. But before he could take a single step, the final slide of that sequence appeared, and this one contained something none of the guests had expected. It was a legal document signed only 3 weeks earlier, The title across the top read, Transfer of Remaining Estate. Beneath it, my name appeared once more, followed by a short statement confirming that everything I still owned, the small savings account, the insurance money from my husband's passing, and the remaining land outside town that Daniel had once hoped to develop, had been placed into a charitable trust, benefiting the children's hospital where I worked. A soft gasp spread across the room as the meaning of those words became clear. Daniel stopped walking immediately, his eyes widening slightly, while Lena stared at the screen as if she were trying to force the text to disappear. The attorney's voice spoke one final sentence through the speakers, calm and measured. Margaret Hale chose this arrangement because she believed her sons already had everything they needed to build successful lives. When the screen faded to black again, the room remained perfectly still. 200 guests sat quietly in their chairs now, not laughing, not whispering, simply absorbing the truth that had unfolded in front of them. And for the first time since that wedding began, my children understood something they had never expected to face that evening. The story they had tried to tell about me had ended very differently than they planned. But the night was not finished yet. Because the final chapter of this story was not on the screen at all. It was still sitting quietly at table 17 near the kitchen doors. By the time the lights in the reception hall slowly brightened again, the entire room felt like a different place from the one that had existed only 20 minutes earlier. Conversations had stopped completely. Glasses remained untouched on the tables, and every guest seemed unsure what they were supposed to do next. For a moment, no one moved at all, and then Daniel turned slowly toward the back corner of the hall, where I was still sitting quietly at table 17. Our eyes met across the distance between us, and for the first time in many years, I saw something in his expression that I had not seen since he was a young boy, standing beside his father in our old backyard workshop. Uncertainty. He walked toward me slowly now, the confident energy he had carried throughout the wedding replaced by a stiffness that suggested he was no longer entirely sure how to face the woman sitting in that chair. Lena remained at the head table watching nervously, while the guests followed Daniel's movement with silent attention. When he reached my table, he stopped a few feet away, as if an invisible line had been drawn between us. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I could hear the faint sounds of the kitchen doors swinging behind me, the distant clatter of dishes, and the quiet breathing of 200 people pretending not to listen while they watched what would happen next. Daniel finally cleared his throat and said, my name softly, the way he used to say it when he was younger and needed help with something he didn't understand. Mom! The word lingered in the air between us, heavy with years of distance that neither of us quite knew how to cross. I looked at him carefully then, noticing the tired lines around his eyes, the nervous way his hands moved as he searched for the right words. In that moment, I realized something important about regret. It doesn't arrive loudly like anger or betrayal. It arrives quietly when someone finally understands the consequences of their own choices. Why didn't you ever tell us? He asked after a moment, his voice low enough that only I could hear it clearly. I considered that question carefully before answering, because the truth was both simple and difficult at the same time. Because you never asked, I said gently. He lowered his eyes at that, the weight of the evening settling visibly onto his shoulders. For several seconds, neither of us spoke again, and then he pulled out the chair across from me and sat down slowly. Around us, the guests continued pretending to focus on their conversations, though it was obvious everyone in the room was still listening. I thought you hated us, Daniel admitted quietly, staring down at the tablecloth while his fingers traced the edge of a folded napkin. I felt a small ache move through my chest at those words, not because they were cruel, but because they revealed how deeply our family had misunderstood one another over the years. "I never hated you," I said after a moment, my voice calm and steady. "I just learned how to live without being needed." Daniel looked up at me then, his eyes searching my face, the way children sometimes search their parents for answers that cannot easily be given. Across the room, Lena remained frozen beside the head table, clearly unsure whether she should approach us or stay where she was. For a long moment, the reception hall remained suspended in that fragile quiet, while the truth of our family finally sat openly between us. Then Daniel spoke again, his voice softer this time. "Is there any way to fix this?" he asked. I thought about that question longer than he probably expected, because forgiveness is not something that appears instantly, just because someone finally recognizes their mistakes. It grows slowly, carefully, the same way trust does. Finally, I reached across the table and placed my hand gently over his trembling fingers. "Some things can still be repaired," I said quietly, "but only if people are willing to start telling the truth." Daniel nodded slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly as he absorbed those words. Around us, the guests began speaking again in quiet voices, the spell of the evening gradually loosening as waiters resumed carrying trays of champagne through the room. The wedding would continue. The music would eventually start again, and people would return to their conversations about ordinary things. But something important had changed that night. Something none of us could pretend had never happened, because the story my children had tried to write about me ended very differently than they expected. And as Daniel sat across from me at that small table near the kitchen doors, I realized the truth had done something remarkable. It had not only revealed the past, it had given us a chance, however fragile, to decide what the future of our family might look like next. By the time the lights in the reception hall slowly brightened again, the room felt very different from the one that had existed only half an hour earlier. The laughter that had once filled the space was gone, replaced by a quiet tension that lingered in the air like the final echo of a storm. Conversations returned slowly, cautiously, but no one seemed quite sure how to behave anymore. When the truth finally steps into a room, it leaves footprints that are impossible to ignore. Daniel remained seated across from me, his shoulders lower now, his expression uncertain in a way I had not seen since he was a boy. The confident groom who had stood proudly beside his bride earlier that evening looked suddenly younger, almost lost. For a long moment he stared at the table between us before finally speaking, his voice rough with something he was still trying to understand. "Mom, I didn't know any of this." I studied his face carefully then, noticing the tired lines near his eyes, the nervous way his fingers tapped the edge of the table. In that moment, I believed him. Not because ignorance removes responsibility, but because I could see the realization forming slowly inside him, the painful understanding that the story he had believed about me was never the whole truth. The reception hall had grown quiet again without anyone realizing it. People were pretending to focus on their conversations, but their attention kept drifting back toward our small table near the kitchen doors. "I thought you hated us," Daniel said quietly. The words carried a sadness that surprised me more than anger ever could. I shook my head gently. "I never hated you," I told him. "I just learned how to live without being needed." Daniel lowered his eyes at that, and for several seconds neither of us spoke. Then I reached into my purse and pulled out a small envelope that had been waiting there since earlier that afternoon. I slid it across the table toward him. He opened it slowly. Inside was an old photograph, the corners slightly worn with age. It showed two small boys standing beside their father in our backyard workshop, each of them holding the tiny wooden toolboxes he had made for them. Their smiles were wide, careless, full of the kind of happiness children carry without thinking. Daniel stared at the photograph for a long time. "Your father believed families could survive almost anything," I said softly. "But only if people were brave enough to remember what love looks like." Across the room, Lena had started walking toward us, her steps careful, uncertain. Daniel looked over his shoulder once, then back at me. "Are you leaving?" he asked. I smiled gently. "Yes," I said, "but not because I'm angry." I stood slowly from the chair, and the quiet movement seemed to ripple across the hall as several guests noticed. Daniel rose as well, watching me carefully, as if he were trying to hold on to something that had only just begun to make sense. I reached up and touched his cheek, the same way I used to when he was a child preparing to leave for school. "You already have everything you need to build a good life," I told him softly. "The only question left is what kind of man you choose to be while you build it." For a moment he looked like he wanted to say something more, something that had been waiting years to be spoken, but the words never quite came. Instead, he pulled me into a quiet embrace, awkward at first, then warmer, the way hugs sometimes feel when two people are remembering how to be family again. When he stepped back, his eyes were shining, though he tried to hide it. I picked up my purse and began walking toward the exit. The guests moved aside politely as I passed their tables, their expressions thoughtful now, instead of amused. By the time I reached the doors, the cool night air had already begun drifting into the hall. Outside, the parking lot was quiet beneath the dark sky. The breeze carried the faint smell of autumn leaves, and for the first time that evening my chest felt lighter than it had in years. I paused beside the waiting taxi and looked back once through the tall windows of the reception hall. The music had started again, soft and distant, and people were slowly returning to their conversations. Life always continues. As the taxi pulled away, the lights of the country club grew smaller behind us, fading into the quiet road ahead. And somewhere, during that silent drive, I realized something simple. I had spent most of my life building a future for my children. Now, for the first time in many years, it was finally time to live one for myself. If this story meant something to you, show your support by liking the video and subscribing to Silent Tales Studio, where silence speaks and stories answer.